Power isn't given, it's taken. And control is simply recognizing that everyone ultimately is just a puppet waiting for direction. Have you ever looked at a master of manipulation and felt a surge of envy, believing their web of secrets was the ultimate sign of strength? We are told that to lead is to deceive, and to win is to outmaneuver the hearts of those around you. You might have even started to believe that your mask, that cold, calculating version of yourself, is a suit of armor protecting you from a world of enemies. But what if the very strategies you use to control others are actually the walls of your own prison? What if the master isn't the one holding the strings, but the one most terrified of them breaking? The truth that most power seekers realize too late is that manipulation isn't power, it is a desperate form of dependency. If your success requires the constant deception of others, you aren't a leader, you are a slave to their perception. This is the story of Julian, a man who climbed to the top using every law of power, only to find that the higher he rose, the weaker he became. Stay with me, because you're about to see why the mask of the master is the heaviest burden of all. Julian stood in the glass-walled corridor of the executive wing, the hum of the air conditioning sounding like the steady breath of a beast he had finally tamed. In his hand, he held the keys to a new corner office, the spoils of a war fought not with weapons, but with the cold precision of the laws of power. Just an hour ago, he had sat in a review meeting and watched as his closest ally, Sarah, was passed over for the very promotion they had both worked toward. Julian hadn't shouted her down, he had simply followed the law of concealing his intentions. He had whispered the right doubts into the director's ear weeks prior, playing the role of the concerned friend while subtly highlighting Sarah's emotional nature, a strategic move to make himself appear as the only rational choice. As he watched Sarah pack her desk through the glass, a surge of adrenaline masked the hollow ache of betrayal. He told himself this was the price of greatness. Law 2 warned that friends were the quickest to betray, so he had betrayed her first. He felt a sense of intoxicating superiority, a belief that he was the only one in the room playing the game at a higher level. The world, he decided, was a chessboard, and everyone else was merely a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or discarded. Julian walked into his new office, the scent of fresh leather and expensive floor wax greeting him. He sat in the oversized chair and looked out at the city, feeling like a titan. He had outmaneuvered a friend, secured his status, and appeared completely beyond reproach. In that moment, he felt invincible. He believed that his ability to detach from his conscience was his greatest strength. He was a master of the mask, a practitioner of the calculated strike. But as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across his pristine desk, Julian didn't notice the subtle shift in the room's energy. He didn't see that by cutting the ties of trust, he was beginning to float away from the very ground that once supported him. He felt powerful, yes, but it was the power of a man standing alone on a pedestal that was starting to narrow, leaving him with nowhere to move but down. The prestige of the new office, with its panoramic views and hushed atmosphere, soon revealed itself to be a gilded cage. Julian quickly discovered that when you climb to the top by treating people as pawns, you assume everyone else is doing the same. The intoxicating high of the promotion evaporated, replaced by the relentless, grinding weight of the paranoia tax. Every greeting in the hallway now felt like a coded interrogation, every email was a potential trap hidden in corporate jargon. He found himself obsessively applying Law 5, guarding his reputation with his life, but the more he guarded it, the more fragile it felt. He began to see enemies in every shadow, convinced that his colleagues were dissecting his every move just as he had once dissected Sarah's. Nightfall brought no reprieve. Julian would lie awake in his expensive bed, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced through endless what-if scenarios. He replayed conversations from the day, agonizing over whether he had said too much or revealed a chink in his armor. He was terrified of Law 18, the danger of isolation, yet he was equally terrified of letting anyone close enough to see the man behind the mask. To maintain his image of effortless power, he had to be hypervigilant, monitoring his expressions in the mirror and rehearsing his amiable smiles until they felt like a physical strain. The exhaustion was different from the physical fatigue he had known as a junior analyst. This was a soul-deep erosion. He was paying a tax on his peace of mind that he could no longer afford. He spent his evenings scouring social media and internal memos, looking for signs of a coup, his pulse spiking at every whispered conversation near the water cooler. He had won the office, but he had lost the ability to rest. He realized, with a cold shiver of dread, that his power was entirely dependent on the vigilance of his defense. He was the king of a hill that everyone wanted to claim, and because he had used treachery to take it, he knew exactly how vulnerable he truly was. The mask was no longer something he put on for meetings, it had become a heavy, suffocating skin he could never take off, leaving him wide-eyed and trembling in the dark, a prisoner of the very reputation he had fought so hard to build. The prestige of the executive wing had become a hall of mirrors, and Julian was lost in the reflections. To maintain his grip on power, he had fully embraced the law of formlessness, becoming a human chameleon who shifted his colors to match whoever stood before him. In the boardroom, he was a stone-faced predator. In the employee lounge, he was the relatable mentor. In the director's office, he was the humble servant. He believed this was the ultimate strategic advantage, to be a ghost that no one could pin down, a man with 1,000 faces and no discernible shadow. But the formless trap was a silent predator. One evening, after a long day of performing, Julian stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office and realized he didn't know which version of himself was supposed to go home. He looked at his hands and felt as though they belonged to a stranger. He had spent so long concealing his true intentions that he had reached inward and found that his intentions had vanished entirely. By being everything to everyone, he had effectively become nothing to himself. He was no longer a man with a vision, he was a hollow shell, a collection of borrowed personalities and rehearsed gestures designed to appease or manipulate others. The realization hit him like a physical blow: he wasn't the puppet master. He was the most controlled person in the building. Every word he spoke was dictated by the expectations of his audience. Every smile was a tactical requirement. He was a slave to the very people he sought to dominate, forced to adjust his soul to fit their molds just to stay relevant. He had optimized his life for power, but in the process, he had deleted his identity. As the city lights twinkled outside, indifferent to his success, Julian felt a terrifying void where his conviction used to be. He had mastered the art of being formless, only to find that he had no substance left to hold onto. He had won the corporate chessboard, but as he stood in the silence, he realized he wasn't the player anymore, he was just a hollow piece being moved by the fear of being seen for who he truly was. The collapse began not with a roar, but with a leaked document and a plummeting stock price. A major regulatory crisis struck the firm, a structural failure that threatened to pull the entire executive floor into the abyss. In the past, Julian would have viewed this as an opportunity to stir up muddy waters to catch the fish, but as the walls closed in, he realized he had no ground to stand on. He was the head of the department now, and the target was painted directly on his chest. For the first time, the formless man needed a solid foundation, and he found only sand. He paced his office, his breath hitching as he dialed Sarah's number. He needed her technical expertise, the kind of brilliant, deep-dive analysis that had once made them an unbeatable team. He needed the loyalty he had traded for a corner office. The phone rang until it hit voicemail, a cold, digital rejection that tasted like ash. He tried the others, the junior analysts he had manipulated, the peers he had outshined to please the masters. One by one, the doors remained shut. In the cafeteria and the boardrooms, the silence that met him was deafening. By following the laws of power, he had successfully ensured that no one felt they owed him a thing. He had outmaneuvered their affection and strategically deleted their trust. A frantic meeting was called in the main boardroom, and as Julian looked around the table, he saw the faces of people he had used according to Law 7. They sat with their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable masks, the very masks Julian had taught them to wear. When the director asked for a volunteer to lead the damage control, the room turned toward Julian, but not with support. It was a predatory gaze. They were letting him take the lead not because they trusted him, but because they knew he was the perfect sacrificial lamb. He realized then that his power was a hallucination. True strength in a crisis comes from a network of people willing to bleed for you because they believe in you. Julian had no believers, he only had survivors who were waiting for him to trip. He had spent years ensuring he was never dependent on anyone, and now, in his moment of greatest need, he got exactly what he asked for. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. As the director's cold eyes locked onto his, Julian felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't the master of the chessboard, he was a solitary piece that had been pushed so far out into the open that there was no one left to protect his flank. He was powerful on paper, but in the heat of the fire, he was the weakest man in the room. The final board meeting felt less like a professional gathering and more like a public execution. Julian sat at the head of the table, the weight of 1,000 deceptions pressing down on his shoulders. The director looked at him expectantly, waiting for the polished lie, the strategic scapegoat, or the formless deflection Julian was famous for. But as Julian opened his mouth, the script he had rehearsed, the one that followed every law of power to protect his reputation, suddenly felt like poison. He looked at the faces around the room, the people he had manipulated, the enemies he had manufactured, and he felt a profound, exhausting disgust for the man he had become. Julian did something the laws of power would consider professional suicide. He dropped the mask. He didn't offer a calculated defense. Instead, he spoke the truth. He admitted his mistakes, he took full responsibility for the regulatory failure, and he publicly apologized to Sarah for the betrayal that had bought him his seat. The silence that followed was unlike the paranoid quiet he was used to. It was a heavy, transformative stillness. By surrendering his defense, he had surrendered his fear. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating the next move, he was standing on the solid ground of his own character. The director's face twisted in confusion, and the pawns around the table looked at each other, their masks finally slipping in the face of such raw, unexpected honesty. Julian was fired that afternoon. He walked out of the building with nothing but a cardboard box and a sense of lightness that bordered on euphoria. He had lost the corner office, the title, and the prestige, but as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt a strength he had never known. He had spent years trying to be a master through manipulation, only to realize that true power is the freedom to be known. In the weeks that followed, Julian didn't disappear into the shadows. He reached out to Sarah, not with a strategic intent, but with genuine remorse. To his surprise, she met him. They didn't talk about power dynamics, they talked about the work. He began to build something new, not a throne made of secrets, but a career built on transparency and real alliances. He realized that a man who can be honest is a man who can never be blackmailed. A man who has true friends is a man who can never be truly isolated. He had traded the 48 laws for a single, unshakable truth, that vulnerability is the foundation of courage, and integrity is the only power that doesn't make you weak. Julian was no longer a player on a chessboard, he was a human being, finally free to move in any direction he chose.